The sleek private jet gleamed under the midday sun, ready to take off on what seemed like a routine flight. Inside the cockpit, Ethan Carter, a young and ambitious pilot, adjusted his headset with practiced precision. Flying wasn't just a job for him, it was his passion, his escape, and his purpose. At just 28, Ethan had already built a reputation for being calm under pressure, a skill that would soon be tested in ways he could never imagine. In the cabin, Sophia Bennett, a world-renowned fashion designer, settled into her seat. Known for her bold designs and even bolder personality, Sophia was a force to be reckoned with in the fashion world. But beneath her confident exterior was a woman who had spent years chasing perfection, often at the expense of her own happiness. She was on her way to Paris for the launch of her latest collection, a career-defining moment. Yet, as she scrolled through emails on her tablet, she muttered under her breath, "Another flight, another deadline." Ethan glanced back briefly, catching a glimpse of Sophia. Even without speaking, he could sense her commanding presence. Just another VIP, he thought, shaking his head. He had flown plenty of high-profile passengers before, and they all seemed the same, demanding, impatient, and oblivious to the world around them. But neither Ethan nor Sophia could have predicted what was about to happen. This flight would change their lives forever, forcing them to confront not only the elements, but also themselves. The jet soared smoothly into the sky, cutting through the clouds with ease. Ethan's focus was entirely on the controls, his co-pilot beside him running through routine checks. Everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. A faint beeping sound broke the calm. Ethan frowned, glancing at the instrument panel. A warning light blinked ominously. "That's strange," he murmured, leaning closer. "What's up?" his co-pilot asked, sensing the shift in Ethan's demeanor. "Looks like a small anomaly," Ethan replied, his voice steady but his gut tightening. He toggled a few switches, trying to diagnose the issue. Then his heart sank. The radar showed a massive storm system forming ahead, far larger and faster moving than the forecast had predicted. Ethan grabbed the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've encountered some unexpected weather. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. It might get a little bumpy." In the cabin, Sophia barely looked up from her tablet. "Noted," she said curtly, more annoyed than concerned. She had deadlines to meet, and turbulence wasn't going to stop her. Her assistant, however, clung nervously to the armrests, glancing toward the cockpit door. The turbulence hit harder than expected. Overhead compartments rattled and the lights flickered. Ethan's hands moved with precision, adjusting the controls as the plane shuddered violently. But then the worst happened. A loud bang echoed through the cabin, followed by the unmistakable sound of engines failing. "Mayday, mayday," Ethan's voice crackled over the intercom. "We've lost engine power, preparing for an emergency landing." Sophia's tablet slid off her lap as the plane lurched violently. For the first time in years, she felt completely powerless. Her assistant screamed, clutching the seatbelt as the plane began to descend rapidly. In the cockpit, Ethan's calm exterior masked the adrenaline coursing through him. His co-pilot looked pale but focused. "We're going down," Ethan said grimly. "Brace for impact." The next few moments were a blur of chaos. The sound of rushing wind, the blaring of warning alarms, and the jarring impact as the plane hit the ground. Ethan had managed to guide the jet toward a small clearing on an uncharted island, but the landing was anything but smooth. The plane skidded across the sand, its nose buried in the ground, smoke billowing from the damaged engines. For a moment there was silence. Then Ethan's voice broke through, hoarse but steady. "Is everyone okay?" Sophia unbuckled her seatbelt with trembling hands, her chest heaving as she looked around. I think so," she stammered, her voice shaky, but as she glanced toward the back of the cabin, her heart sank. Her assistant was slumped over, motionless. Ethan emerged from the cockpit, his uniform rumpled and his face smudged with dirt. His gaze swept over Sophia, briefly assessing her condition before moving to the others. The grim reality hit them both. Ethan's co-pilot and Sophia's assistant hadn't survived the crash. With heavy hearts, Ethan and Sophia worked together to dig shallow graves in the soft sand, marking them with driftwood crosses. They stood there for a moment, murmuring a quiet prayer. It's just us now, Ethan said, his voice steady despite the weight of loss. We're alive, he added, his tone both relieved and serious. But we're stuck. Sophia turned to him, her CEO composure cracking under the weight of the situation. Stuck? What do you mean, stuck? Ethan gestured to the wreckage and the dense jungle beyond. We're on a deserted island in the middle of nowhere. The radio's fried, the plane's totaled, and no one knows we're here. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Ethan, then at the wreckage around her, and realized the truth of his words. This wasn't just a delay. This was survival. The first morning on the island was harsh and unforgiving. Sophia woke to the sound of waves crashing against the shore and the distant cries of seagulls. Her body ached from the rough landing, and the glaring sunlight made her squint. Around her, remnants of the plane were scattered, a stark reminder of their predicament. Ethan was already up, standing a few feet away and studying the horizon with a determined expression. His uniform shirt was torn, his face streaked with dirt, but he seemed unfazed. "Good morning, Sleeping Beauty," he said when he noticed her stirring. Sophia groaned, sitting up and brushing sand off her designer pants. "This can't be happening," she muttered. "Do you have any idea how long it's going to take for someone to find us?" Ethan turned to her, his expression calm but serious. "It's hard to say. We're way off course, and the radio's completely fried. Until someone comes looking, and that could take days or even weeks. We need to focus on surviving." "Surviving?" Sophia echoed incredulously. "I'm not a castaway, Ethan. I run a multi-million-dollar fashion empire. I have meetings, deadlines." "Well," Ethan interrupted, a hint of sarcasm in his tone, "unless you can conference call a coconut, those deadlines will have to wait." Sophia shot him a glare, but Ethan was already moving. "Stay here," he said. "I'm going to scout the area, see if there's fresh water nearby." As he disappeared into the jungle, Sophia sat back, staring at the wreckage and the endless expanse of ocean. For the first time in her life, she had no control, and it terrified her. Sophia sat on a piece of driftwood, arms crossed, glaring at the wreckage of the plane. The heat was unbearable, and the salty air clung to her skin. She had never felt so out of place in her life. Her world was one of luxury, control, and solutions at her fingertips. Here there was nothing but sand, trees, and a man who seemed far too calm for the situation. Ethan returned a few hours later, carrying a handful of coconuts and a determined expression. "There's a small stream about 200 yards into the jungle," he said, pointing toward the dense greenery. "It's fresh water. We'll need to build something to collect it, but it's a start." Sophia wrinkled her nose. "You expect me to drink from a stream? What about bottled water? Surely there's something left in the wreckage." Ethan sighed, his patience already wearing thin. "Most of the supplies burned in the crash. Whatever's left won't last us more than a day or two." "This is our best option." Sophia scoffed, her frustration bubbling over. "You seem to know a lot about this. Do you moonlight as a survivalist or something?" "I was a scout growing up," Ethan replied simply, setting the coconuts down. "And I've been trained for emergencies like this. It's part of being a pilot." "Well, good for you," Sophia muttered, sinking back onto the driftwood. She watched as Ethan began cracking open a coconut with a sharp piece of metal salvaged from the wreckage. The ease with which he worked only irritated her more. Ethan glanced at her, noticing her sour expression. "Look," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I get that this isn't the life you're used to. But out here, none of that matters. We're equals. If we're going to survive, we both need to pitch in. So, are you with me or not?" Sophia stared at him, her pride battling with the reality of their situation. Finally, she exhaled and nodded. "Fine. What do you need me to do?" Over the next few hours, Ethan showed Sophia how to crack open coconuts for water, weave palm fronds for a makeshift shelter, and start a fire using scraps of metal from the wreckage. It wasn't easy. Sophia struggled with tasks that seemed second nature to Ethan, and her frustration often boiled over. "This is ridiculous," she snapped after her fifth failed attempt to spark a fire. "Why do I even need to learn this? Isn't this your job?" "My job," Ethan said evenly, "was to get you to your destination safely. Since the plane is out of commission, I'm improvising, and so are you." Sophia threw the sticks down, glaring at him. "You're enjoying this, aren't you? Watching me fail?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "No, I'm not. But I am trying to keep us alive, which would be a hell of a lot easier if you stopped fighting me at every turn." They stared at each other for a tense moment before Sophia looked away, her shoulders sagging. "This is just not what I'm built for," she admitted, her voice quieter. "No one's built for this," Ethan said, his tone softening. "You adapt, or you don't make it. That's how it works." By evening, they had managed to build a small shelter and start a fire. As the flames crackled, casting flickering light across the beach, Sophia sat beside Ethan, her exhaustion evident. "I guess I should thank you," she said grudgingly. Ethan smirked. "Don't strain yourself." She gave him a sideways glance, but couldn't help the faint smile that tugged at her lips. Despite her initial irritation with him, Sophia had to admit that Ethan's resourcefulness was impressive. He had a quiet confidence that was both reassuring and humbling. As the night deepened, the two of them sat in silence, staring at the fire. The reality of their situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. They were alone, isolated, with no guarantee of rescue. But for now, at least, they had each other and a fire to keep the darkness at bay. The next morning, Sophia woke to the sound of Ethan chopping wood. She groaned, her body still sore from the crash. "Do you ever stop?" she muttered, sitting up. Ethan glanced at her, a small smile playing on his lips. "Not if I can help it. We've got a lot to do today." Sophia rolled her eyes, but followed him as he explained their plan for the day. They needed to reinforce the shelter, gather more food, and find a way to store water from the stream. Ethan handed her a bundle of palm fronds. "Start weaving these. I'll show you how." Sophia frowned at the fronds, her fingers fumbling as she tried to mimic Ethan's movements. "This is impossible," she muttered. "It's not impossible," Ethan said, crouching beside her. "It just takes practice. Here, let me show you again." As the day went on, Sophia began to get the hang of it. Her frustration gave way to a sense of accomplishment as she completed her first woven panel. "Not bad," Ethan said, inspecting her work. "You're a quick learner." Sophia couldn't help but smile, a small spark of pride lighting up inside her. For the first time since the crash, she felt like she was contributing. That afternoon, they ventured into the jungle to gather food. Ethan showed Sophia how to identify edible plants and crack open coconuts for sustenance. "Here, try this," he said, handing her a piece of fruit he'd sliced open with his pocket knife. Sophia eyed it warily. "Are you sure it's safe?" "I've eaten it before," Ethan assured her. Reluctantly, Sophia took a bite. To her surprise, it was sweet and refreshing. "Not bad," she admitted. "See, you're a natural," Ethan teased, his grin making Sophia chuckle despite herself. As they made their way back to the shelter, Sophia slipped on a moss-covered rock and fell with a yelp. She landed hard, her leg wedged awkwardly in a narrow crevice. "Ethan," she called, her voice trembling with pain. Ethan rushed to her side, his expression serious. "Stay still," he said calmly. "I'm going to get you out." Using all his strength, Ethan pried the rock loose and carefully freed Sophia's leg. She winced as he helped her up, leaning heavily on him for support. "Can you walk?" he asked, his tone gentle but concerned. "Do you think so?" Sophia said, though her voice was shaky. Ethan wrapped an arm around her waist, guiding her back to the shelter. Once they were safely inside, he examined her leg more closely. "It's just a sprain," he said after a moment. "You'll be okay, but you need to rest." Sophia nodded, her usual composure giving way to vulnerability. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" Ethan asked, genuinely puzzled. "For saving me," Sophia replied, meeting his gaze. Ethan gave her a small smile. It's what I do. The days on the island began to blur together, each one marked by the same routine, gathering food, reinforcing their shelter, and trying to stay hopeful. But as the days stretched into weeks, something began to shift between Ethan and Sophia. The initial tension and frustration that had defined their relationship gave way to something softer, something neither of them had expected. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ethan sat by the fire, sharpening a makeshift spear he had crafted for fishing. Sophia sat nearby, her injured leg propped up on a piece of driftwood. She was weaving palm fronds into a basket, her movements now confident and precise. "You've gotten pretty good at that," Ethan said, nodding toward her handiwork. Sophia smirked. "Well, I had a good teacher, though I'm still not sure this is the career change I was looking for." Ethan chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "I don't know, you might be onto something. Survival chic? A new fashion line inspired by island living." Sophia laughed, a sound that surprised even her. It had been so long since she'd felt lighthearted. "I'll keep that in mind for my next collection," she said, her tone teasing. For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, the crackling fire filling the space between them. Then Sophia spoke, her voice quieter. "You know, I've been thinking, if we don't get rescued, what happens to everything I've built? My company, my career? It'll all just disappear." Ethan set down the spear, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe, but does it really matter?" Sophia looked at him, startled. "Of course it matters. I've worked my entire life to get where I am." "I get that," Ethan said, meeting her gaze. "But out here, none of that defines you. You're not Sophia Bennett, the fashion mogul. You're just Sophia. And honestly, I think I like this version of you better." Sophia blinked, caught off guard by his words. "You don't even know me," she said, though her voice lacked its usual sharpness. "Maybe not," Ethan admitted, "but I've seen you adapt, learn, and push through things you never thought you could handle. That says a lot about who you are." Sophia looked away, her cheeks warming. She wasn't used to being seen like this, stripped of her titles and accomplishments, just a person trying to survive. And yet, Ethan's words felt strangely comforting. The next day, Ethan decided to teach Sophia how to fish. Her leg was healing, and she was eager to prove she could contribute more. They waded into the shallow water together, the cool waves lapping at their ankles. "Hold the spear like this," Ethan instructed, positioning her hands on the wooden shaft. "And when you see a fish, aim just below it. The water bends the light so the fish isn't exactly where it looks like it is." Sophia frowned, concentrating. "This feels like trying to thread a needle blindfolded." Ethan laughed. "It's not that bad. Just be patient." They stood side by side, the sun beating down on their backs. Sophia's first few attempts were clumsy, the spear splashing into the water and scaring the fish away, but Ethan was patient, guiding her movements and offering encouragement. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sophia managed to spear a small fish. She let out a triumphant laugh, holding it up for Ethan to see. "I did it!" Ethan grinned. "See? I told you you'd get the hang of it." Sophia beamed, her earlier frustrations forgotten. For the first time, she felt like she was truly a part of their survival efforts, not just a burden. That evening, as they cooked the fish over the fire, Sophia found herself opening up to Ethan in a way she never had with anyone else. She told him about her childhood, growing up in a small town where no one believed she'd ever make it in the fashion world. She talked about the sacrifices she'd made, the relationships she'd lost, and the constant pressure to stay on top. Ethan listened intently, his eyes never leaving hers. When she finished, he nodded thoughtfully. "You've been through a lot," he said. "But it sounds like you've spent so much time proving yourself to everyone else that you forgot to ask what you really want." Sophia stared at him, his words hitting closer to home than she cared to admit. "I don't know," she said softly. I guess I've never really thought about it. Ethan hesitated, then spoke. For what it's worth, I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for. And I think you're capable of a lot more than just running a company. Sophia smiled faintly, the warmth in his voice wrapping around her like a blanket. Thanks, she said. That means a lot. As the days passed, their bond deepened. They worked together seamlessly, their once clashing personalities now complementing each other. Ethan's practicality balanced Sophia's creativity, and Sophia's determination inspired Ethan to keep pushing forward. One night, as they sat by the fire, Ethan pulled out a small notebook he had salvaged from the wreckage. What's that? Sophia asked, curious. It's my flight log, Ethan explained. I always keep one with me. I've been using it to keep track of the days we've been here. Sophia leaned closer, her interest piqued. How many days has it been? 23, Ethan said, flipping through the pages. Almost a month. Sophia's eyes widened. It feels like it's been so much longer. Ethan nodded. Time moves differently out here. They fell silent, the weight of their situation settling over them. Then Ethan spoke, his voice quiet. Do you ever think about what you'll do if we get rescued? Sophia hesitated, then nodded. I used to think I'd just go back to my old life, pick up where I left off, but now I'm not so sure. Ethan looked at her, his expression unreadable. What do you mean? Sophia met his gaze, her heart pounding. I mean, this place has changed me. You've changed me. I don't think I can go back to being the person I was before. Ethan's breath caught, his chest tightening. He had been trying to ignore the growing feelings he had for Sophia, but hearing her say those words made it impossible to deny. Sophia, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. Before he could say more, Sophia leaned in, her lips brushing against his. The kiss was tentative at first, but it quickly deepened, the firelight casting flickering shadows around them. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless. I've been wanting to do that for a while, Sophia admitted, her cheeks flushed. Ethan smiled, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. Me too. For the first time since the crash, the island didn't feel so lonely. They had found something unexpected in the midst of their struggle each other. The morning after their kiss, the air between Ethan and Sophia felt different, warmer, more intimate. They worked side by side, as they had for weeks, but now there was an unspoken connection, a quiet understanding that neither of them needed to put into words. For the first time, the island didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a place where they had found something rare and precious. But their fragile bubble of peace was about to burst. It started with a distant sound, a faint hum that grew louder with each passing second. Ethan froze, his ears straining. Do you hear that? He asked, his voice sharp with urgency. Sophia stopped weaving palm fronds and tilted her head. What is it? Ethan's heart raced as the sound became unmistakable. A plane, he said, his voice filled with both hope and panic. It's a plane. Without another word, Ethan grabbed the makeshift signal fire they had prepared weeks ago. He sprinted toward the beach, Sophia close behind him, her injured leg forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. Together, they piled dry leaves and driftwood onto the fire, fanning the flames until thick black smoke billowed into the sky. Come on, Ethan muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the horizon. The plane was a tiny speck in the distance, but it was getting closer. Sophia grabbed his arm, her voice trembling. Do you think they'll see us? They have to, Ethan said, though his voice betrayed his own uncertainty. Minutes felt like hours as they watched the plane approach. Then, just as it seemed to pass over them, it banked sharply, circling back. A flare shot into the sky, signaling that they had been spotted. They saw us, Sophia cried, tears streaming down her face. She turned to Ethan, throwing her arms around him. We're going home. Ethan held her tightly, relief washing over him. But as the reality of their rescue sank in, a strange heaviness settled in his chest. Going home meant leaving the island, and leaving behind the life they had built together. The rescue team arrived later that day, a helicopter landing on the beach with a deafening roar. Sophia and Ethan shielded their eyes from the sand kicked up by the rotor blades as a group of uniformed men approached them. "Are you two okay?" one of the rescuers asked, his voice loud enough to be heard over the noise. "We're fine," Ethan replied, his arm still around Sophia. "Just ready to get out of here." The rescuers handed them water bottles and blankets, checking them for injuries before leading them to the helicopter. As they climbed aboard, Sophia glanced back at the island, her heart twisting. It had been a place of hardship and loss, but it had also been the place where she had found herself and Ethan. Ethan caught her gaze and gave her a small, reassuring smile. "We'll be okay," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. The flight back to civilization was surreal. Sophia stared out the window, watching the island shrink into the distance until it was nothing more than a speck on the horizon. Ethan sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on hers. Neither of them spoke, the weight of what was coming hanging heavy in the air. When they landed, the world seemed to rush at them all at once. Reporters, cameras, and flashing lights surrounded them as they stepped off the helicopter. Sophia was immediately swept up by her assistant, who had flown in from New York as soon as she heard the news. Ethan, meanwhile, was greeted by his airline's representatives, who bombarded him with questions about the crash. For the first time in weeks, Ethan and Sophia were separated. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Sophia was thrust back into her old life, her schedule packed with interviews, meetings, and the launch of her new collection. But no matter how busy she was, her thoughts always drifted back to Ethan. She missed his steady presence, his quiet strength, and the way he had made her feel like she was more than just her career. Ethan, too, found it hard to adjust. He returned to his job as a pilot, but the cockpit felt empty without Sophia's voice teasing him or asking endless questions about survival. He tried to focus on his work, but every time he looked out at the clouds, he thought of her. One evening, a week after their rescue, Sophia sat in her penthouse apartment, staring at the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her assistant had just left, and the silence was deafening. She picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over Ethan's number. She had memorized it during their time on the island, but she hadn't called him since they'd been rescued. Finally, she took a deep breath and pressed the call button. Ethan answered on the second ring. "Sophia?" "Hi," she said, her voice soft. I wasn't sure if you'd pick up." "Of course I would," Ethan said, his voice warm. "I've been waiting to hear from you." Sophia smiled, her heart lifting. "I miss you," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I miss us." Ethan was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with emotion. "I miss you too. Every day." Sophia closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I don't know how to go back to my old life, Ethan. It doesn't feel right anymore." "Then don't," Ethan said simply. "You don't have to." Sophia opened her eyes, her heart pounding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe the island wasn't just a detour," Ethan said. "Maybe it was the start of something new for both of us." Sophia's breath caught, hope blooming in her chest. "Do you really mean that?" "I do," Ethan said. "But it's up to you, Sophia. What do you want?" Sophia smiled through her tears, her decision already made. "I want you." Sophia didn't waste any time. The very next day, she cleared her schedule, canceled meetings, and booked a flight to Ethan's hometown. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about deadlines or appearances. She was thinking about what truly mattered. And for the first time, she felt free. Ethan was sitting on the porch of his modest home, sipping coffee and staring at the horizon when he heard the sound of a car pulling into his driveway. He stood, his heart racing as he saw Sophia step out, her hair blowing in the breeze, a nervous but determined look on her face. "Sophia," he said, his voice filled with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" She smiled, her eyes glistening. "I realized something," she said, walking toward him. "I don't want to live my life wondering what could have been. I don't want to go back to the person I was before the island, and I don't want to be without you." Ethan stared at her, his chest tightening. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't exactly the life you're used to." Sophia stepped closer, reaching for his hand. "I don't care about any of that," she said firmly. "The island taught me what really matters, and what matters is you." Ethan's lips curved into a smile, and before he could say anything, Sophia leaned in, wrapping her arms around him. He held her tightly, the weight of the past few weeks melting away in her embrace. The next few months were a whirlwind of change. Sophia decided to take a step back from her fashion empire, delegating more responsibilities to her team so she could focus on the things that truly brought her joy. She began designing a new collection inspired by her time on the island, simple, natural, and raw. It was a stark departure from her usual work, but it felt authentic, and, for the first time in years, she felt excited about her craft. Ethan, meanwhile, continued flying, but he made sure to prioritize his time with Sophia. They split their days between his quiet hometown and her bustling city life, finding a balance that worked for both of them. Despite their different worlds, they discovered that they complemented each other perfectly. One evening, as they sat on the beach near Ethan's home, watching the waves roll in, Sophia turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about the island?" she asked. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "All the time," he admitted. "It was the hardest thing I've ever been through, but it was also the best thing." Sophia smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Me too. It's strange, isn't it, how something so terrible can lead to something so beautiful." Ethan wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. "Life has a funny way of working out," he said. "If someone had told me a year ago that I'd crash land on a deserted island and fall in love with a fashion designer, I would have thought they were crazy." Sophia laughed, the sound light and carefree. "And if someone had told me I'd survive on coconuts and learn how to fish, I would have fired them on the spot." They both laughed, the sound mingling with the crashing waves. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the memories of the island washing over them like the tide. A few weeks later, Sophia unveiled her new collection at a small, intimate fashion show. The designs were unlike anything she had ever created, flowing fabrics in earthy tones, inspired by the simplicity and beauty of nature. The show was a resounding success, with critics praising her for her bold new direction. At the end of the show, Sophia stepped onto the runway to address the audience. "This collection is deeply personal to me," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "It was inspired by an experience that changed my life, a time when I was stripped of everything I thought defined me and forced to rediscover who I really was. And in the process, I found something I never expected: love." The audience erupted into applause, but Sophia's eyes were fixed on one person in the crowd: Ethan. He stood at the back of the room, his smile wide and proud. As the applause died down, Sophia walked toward him, her heart pounding. When she reached him, she took his hand and pulled him onto the runway. The crowd gasped, then cheered as Sophia turned to Ethan, her eyes shining. "This is the man who saved me," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "not just on the island, but in every way that matters." Ethan looked at her, his own eyes glistening. "You saved me too," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the cheers. From that moment on, their lives were intertwined in every way. They continued to build a life together, one that was rooted in love, respect, and the lessons they had learned on the island. They traveled, explored, and supported each other's dreams, always remembering the place where it all began. The island had tested them, broken them, and rebuilt them, and in the end, it had given them the greatest gift of all: each other. Sometimes, life's most unexpected detours lead us to exactly where we're meant to be. Ethan and Sophia's story is a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's always a chance for light and love to shine through. Thank you for watching this incredible journey of survival, love, and transformation. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Emma's Stories for more heartwarming and inspiring tales. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. See you in the next video.